They were Algeria's most powerful figures, two generals and the brother of the former president. They were arrested and sentenced during mass protests, but now they've been acquitted of the main accusations against them. What's behind that? And will this spark renewed public anger? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobbie. Now, in Algeria, the younger brother of the deposed president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, and two former intelligence chiefs jailed during mass protest in 2019 have been acquitted by a military court. Sayed Boumediene and generals Mohamed, Me-dene and Atman Tartag had been sentenced to 15 years in prison for plotting against the state and undermining the army. The three were the highest profile prosecutions after the president resigned in April 2019, following 20 years in power and months of protests against his rule. We'll discuss this with our guest shortly. First, we have this report from Mohamed.
Sayed Bouteflika is the brother of Algeria's former president Abdelaziz Bouteflika. He was once viewed as the real power in Algeria after his brother suffered a stroke in 2013. But in September 2019, he was handed a 15-year jail sentence along with two former intelligence chiefs. He and General Mohamed Me-dene, also known as Tawfiq, and General Bashir Tartag were accused of conspiring against the state and plotting to overthrow the government. On Sunday, the three were acquitted. General Tawfiq has been released. Tartag and Saeed are staying in prison to face trial on other charges. The ruling has triggered widespread criticism among supporters of Algeria's Hirak movement that has protested for more than a year against military influence on the country's politics.
I think we should expect the worst, even as we hope for the best. This development will lead to the worsening of Algeria's problems, and Hirak activists are going to return to the streets in their thousands across the country to stop what's going on.
Others say the court ruling might be intended to strengthen national unity.
I think this ruling has to do with the current historical circumstances in the country. It seems to be based on the rule of agreeing to differ. It's an attempt to overcome differences and allow the state to deal with some real challenges facing it, including outside threats close to the borders. It's also part of a plan by President Tebboune to create favorable conditions for the implementation of his political program.
The decision follows the return of former Defense Minister Major General Khalid Nazar from his self-exile in Spain a few weeks ago. Nazar reportedly arrived aboard a private jet that landed at a military airport near the capital Algiers right before Algeria's President Abdelmajid Tebboune announced he's going to call for an early general election. Many Algerians say the incidents are signs of a possible return of the military old guard to power in Algeria. Algeria is undergoing a political crisis as it tries to heal itself from political corruption and economic mismanagement and to reform its democratic system after decades of military-backed one-party rule. In 2019, millions of protesters managed to push long-time President Abdelaziz Bouteflika out of power and unseat most of his senior allies and top-ranking military backers. But the wider public is still unhappy with the pace of reform, with some accusing the new democratically elected president of failure or a lack of will to bring about genuine political change. Mohamed, Al Jazeera.
Okay, let's bring in our guests today. In Paris, we have Amel Boubekeur. She's a research fellow at the School for Advanced Studies and Social Sciences at the Doha Institute in Washington, the States. We have William Lawrence. He's a visiting professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. And in Beirut, we have Dalia Ghanem. She's a resident scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center. Welcome to you all. Amel, can I come to you first? Is the military now calling all the shots in Algeria?
Well, it has been a year that Tebboune has been elected as a president. And what we can see is that there hasn't been any kind of true renewal of the leadership system in Algeria. And actually, even before Tebboune, when Bouteflika arrived at the head of the country in 1999, there was already a problem of leadership. So the current feeling now in Algeria is that there's a kind of fatigue. Nizar, Me-dene are names that were already heard in the 90s. The presidential system with the new president Tebboune has shown that it is not sustainable as long as the army is really in charge of the country. We have had Tebboune absent from the country for a month, 2 months. And what we have observed is that everything was blocked in the absence of President Tebboune, like foreign policy in a context where a lot is happening. Even the choice of COVID vaccines, for example, economic measures that should be urgently taken haven't been yet. So a rising inflation. In a nutshell, the country is in a real crisis, but no new leadership is able to face these challenges. And it is not former generals that have been active in the 90s and during the so-called civil war, even if they are free now, that are going to solve the urgent problems the country is facing.
Okay, we'll come on to those problems during the course of our discussion. Dalia Ghanem, in Beirut, the arrests of these three individuals that we're talking about in March, April 2019, that was seen as a measure of the success of the protest movement. Do these acquittals mean that the protest movement wasn't a success? Does it mean that was actually a failure?
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, the arrest of these political figures, among them the younger the younger brother of former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, was seen as a victory and a tangible result, you know, that the Hirak reached. But again, I do believe that it was. I mean, you need to imagine that a few months ago, a year ago, it was impossible in this country for millions of Algerians to imagine that these political figures and these generals were going one day to be jailed, to be put in trial. So in that sense, I do believe it is a victory. Unfortunately, with this decision to acquit two of them and to free them, it shows that the trials again against Bouteflika, Khatri, and generals were aimed at getting rid of opponents, but it was also political trick for the regime to improve its perception of accountability and transparency. But unfortunately, if anything, these trials and the decision taken yesterday showed that the decision-making process is still very opaque and complex, and it showed the meager strength of the civil state in Algeria.
William Lawrence in Washington, when we talk about protest movements and the reaction to that, generally the political trick kind of thing that Dalia is talking about usually dovetails with somebody high up making a return and exerting real power. Is it possible to give us a sense, if you can, of how much power Sayed Bouteflika still has? I mean, it's too early to say he's a free man because he's not. He's still behind bars, facing charges of corruption, but he has been acquitted on these key charges against him.
Well, the answer goes to the heart of the system in Algeria, and it was never autocratic since the revolution in the 50s and 60s. It was always oligopolistic, and the power struggles are often described as a war of the clans. And so there are these different power centers, somewhat geographically organized, but not entirely, in Algeria that fight against each other. And so Sayed Bouteflika represented one of these clans, and during his brother's tenure in the presidency, was often seen as the most powerful man in Algeria, as the gatekeeper to his brother, particularly after his heart attack in 2013 and his rather invalid status from 13 to 19. And so that is the important thing about Sayed. Let me just add to what the other guests have said about the release. In corrupt autocratic systems, when someone gets arrested, it's not usually what they did, it's who's angry at them. And in this case, in a system of coup after coup and presidents named in occult rooms and then winning in elections sort of dominated by the intelligence and military apparatus, in that system, these three were convicted of plotting against that system where that type of activity was already going on. And I always thought it was peculiar in that a private meeting to save the state, which is how things always happen during transitions of power in Algeria, just such a meeting was the reason they were convicted. So I always saw this arrest and conviction as rather bogus. They all should have been in jail for other reasons.
Okay, so going back to Amel Boubekeur in Paris, if these acquittals actually mean that people high up in the military aren't as angry as they were during the summer of 2019, particularly with Sayed Bouteflika, you were talking in your first answer about the current president. Disappears for 2 months because of coronavirus, comes back, still a heavy smoker, not a good thing to do if you've had COVID-19 for sure, but he's back. He just literally a few days ago signed off on the new constitution. If you read the new constitution, that's about a separation of powers and more transparency. Does that have any real worth and value at all if the military are still pulling the strings?
No, I think Sayed Bouteflika is quite like a detail in the story. What we should focus on is really the new sequence we are in, and that's a sequence that has followed with the death of the former General-in-Chief, Gaid Salah. Gaid Salah, from very historical, accidental reasons, found himself at the head of the army, and he thought that he could be the new providential man of Algeria, and a lot of Algerians believed it as well. He used Tebboune as a piece of his plan and his scenario for ensuring his reign over Algeria, but actually after his death, the army has started to reorganize and to erase what he decided while at the head of the army, on the top of the army. But now the only thing that remained from Gaid Salah's inheritance is really Tebboune himself. Tebboune is president because Gaid Salah wanted Tebboune to be. The constitution, the project and the plan of having new local and legislative elections soon, all of these are actually things that have been decided by Gaid Salah. So now the main problem is that we have an army that is trying to get away from this Gaid Salah heritage, but without having the capability to propose anything new, because the army in Algeria is still blocking its old rhetoric of we don't do politics.
Okay.
So
Amel, just let me pause you there, because I just want to kind of simmer down that point that you're making and knock it forward to what we think might be about to happen. Dalia Yazbek in Beirut. If Amel's analysis of this is accurate, and there's nothing to say it's not, therefore the protest movement in Algeria knows what's really going on. Why are we not hearing from them?
Well, first of all, we need to take into consideration the pandemic. I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic halted the Hirak and the demonstration that were going on for more than a year for students on every Tuesday and for the general population on every Friday. And this is something that we need to remember, because for more than a year, Algerians were able to take up to the streets and to do it in a very peaceful, non-violent, very civic way. Unfortunately, the pandemic put an end to that, and also the repression. One has to talk about what's going on in Algeria right now on the level of a human rights violation. So the Algerian authorities took advantage of the pandemic actually to silence the last voice of dissent, and they've been doing that for months now. We are also talking about a country, and I believe that this is the only country in the world that has totally closed closed its frontiers for more than 270 days. And again, who took the decision? Why this decision has been taken? Thousands of Algerians are being stuck outside Algeria and cannot go back to their countries. And so the Hirak is expressing itself, but again, the pandemic halted everything, and people have been, trying to mobilize on social media. But there again, many newspapers, many media and internet websites have been closed, or the internet has been cut from time to time, again to silence the voice of dissent. So again, I think the real problem is the decision-making process. Who is taking all these decisions? How come, for instance, the Algerian president disappeared for 2 months and we have little to no information about his health? And as Amel said, this is creating a really heavy sense of injustice and of fatigue. Whether the Hirak is going to take up to the street or no, we will see it probably at the end of the pandemic.
Okay, William in Washington, is there a vacuum here that's caused in effect by what Hirak, the opposition movement or the protest movement, hasn't done? Because it seems to me Hirak is very good and was very good, March, April 2019, at saying this is what we're against. Everyone understood that because they peacefully took to the streets for week after week after week. They weren't very good at articulating, actually, that's what we're against, but here is what we are for. So there's still a vacuum. And there's also partly, surely, William, also a vacuum because Hirak doesn't have a leader. There's no one person that the protest movement can coalesce around and say, OK, we're going to make him prime minister for 6 months and then we'll have proper elections.
Well, I think there's a lot of validity in what you're saying. I wouldn't really call it a vacuum. I would call it sort of formlessness or shapelessness, which might be another way to say vacuum. But the Hirak always was leaderless on purpose. And the reason they never went beyond big platitudes about systemic change and eradicating corruption and turning over elites was that beyond that, there wasn't that much consensus among Algerians about exactly what type of system they wanted. And we've seen this in other places with transitions going on in big umbrella movements where these don't get worked out until the system goes. And in this case, the system in place, the establishment in place stayed. And that created the very situation we're in. But let me also say there's another vacuum at work here we were just alluding to, and something that we haven't mentioned yet, which is part of what prompted everything that's going on right now was Tebboun's illness. And the establishment in Algeria went into a bit of a panic when he got very ill and evacuated to Germany. This was a 10-week illness that he had. And then the succession, don't forget that Bouteflika, they couldn't find a successor for him for years and years, since 2013, until the Hirak forced him out. And then we had another succession struggle about to start. And what was happening was they were putting together the pouvoir, the system of deciders that decides who's going to be the successor. And part of that was letting these guys out of jail and repatriating some other key historic figures to try to decrease the amount of dissent. Don't forget these three were in jail for dissenting, right? To reduce the amount of dissent and increase the amount of consensus around who would be Tebboun's successor. And that's still part of the conversation that's going on right now.
Dalia, in Beirut, coming back to you, does that mean that the current president is maybe, for the protest movement, more of a threat than Mr. Bouteflika's brother, in as much as, I mean, he still uses the language of an autocrat. And if one could, one feels like saying to him, look, have you learnt nothing in the intervening 2 years? Because his language is still the DNA of the military.
Yes, I think nothing really changed. You know, this is a man. We replaced a man by another man. We replaced Bouteflika by Tebboune, and Tebboune is a pure system. Till now, what is important is to maintain a balance between making concessions and avoiding fundamental change. Algeria's power elites have designed political and economic adjustments to preserve their own authority. And until February 2019, that worked. But the more pluralist system that the regime has allowed to form remains tightly controlled. And this is what they are still trying to do. But again, that was possible until February 22nd, and things are changing. Despite their desire to keep the status quo, Algerians are no longer to, remain where they used to be before February 22nd. Now we are facing a political stalemate, and serious consultation with the Hirak and the opposition have to be taken seriously. But on one point, to come back to the question of the leadership for the Hirak, I think this is, one of the reasons to explain why the popular movement has achieved so little. I think the absence of leadership is very important in that regard. And I do know that many people will disagree with me, but I will take the risk to say that while I do understand Algerians' refusal, to have a leadership because they have in mind what happened to the movement in Kabylia, in L'Arouche in 2001 and how it's been co-opted, I do believe that, change requires sustained political organizing. Okay. Collectivism and, being on social media is not enough.
Okay.
We need
Let me just put that point about change, Dalia, to Amel, who's been sitting patiently in Paris. Amel, 2019, demonstrations, standoffs, face-offs with the military. Nobody got killed. That was astonishing. It was labelled at the time as the Arab Spring, the sequel. But given our discussion today about the military, about these three people who've been acquitted, do you think this will actually go to a mini Arab Spring in the coming year or so?
Look, the main problem in Algeria, and especially when it comes to Algerian main and top generals, is that they have been so busy to manage the past, manage their accountability, their rivalries, that they haven't been able, even Bouteflika included and Tebboune, they haven't been able to anticipate the crisis and the total current deterioration of the country. Now, the Hirak has brought a lot of things. It has brought a changing political culture, and it has allowed the emergence of a new generation of leaders locally. The problem is, and that's the main question to understand Algeria's future, is how long and to which extent the regime will continue to be successful on the basis of a failed state. That means that even for this new generation of leaders to emerge, of hierarchy leaders to emerge and to play a role in a potential transition in the country, they need proper functioning state institutions. And that's not the case today. That's why we won't see the emergence of a true, genuine democratic leadership within the current Algerian institutions that are totally...
We are trotting towards the end of the programme super fast as usual. Last point to you, William, very briefly. Last point to you specifically, I mean. That point about, the economy, do you get the feeling about Algeria that it's ripe for something else to happen from the ground up, in as much as for it to be balancing its books fiscally, it needs to be selling oil at $100 a barrel. Oil is selling for about $40 a barrel, and the local currency has taken a hit to the tune of 20% against the euro in the past 12 months. The economic fundamentals, they're just not there anymore.
That's exactly right. And what Algerians will tell you is that they had the first Arab Spring in 1988, where they had a full democratic opening. And then much of what unfolded in the other countries unfolded in Algeria in the 90s. And they had these protest waves in Algeria every couple of years that sometimes spike national and usually driven in large part by economic factors. The 1988 protest was the drop in oil prices in 86 that triggered it. And there will be a large protest wave in Algeria in the future. But there needs to be a triggering event, and we don't know what event will trigger that big turnout.
Very, very last answer to you, Dalia, in Beirut. Would it be fair to say the country is less predictable scenario-wise than it was 2 years ago? And also, we can't really say what we think the military might do with the current president or someone who wants to position themselves to become president.
Yes, it is less predictable because of one important factor. The Hirak, the popular movement, actually changed so many things, and it gave people hope, but it also gave people the feeling that they can change things. And the leadership, they couldn't predict. So I believe that Algeria is to remain on the watch list, because 2021 is going to, many things are going to happen in the North African country.
And we will carry on watching the story of Algeria here on Inside Story. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our guests. They were Amel, Boubekeur, William Lawrence and Dalia Ghanem. And thank you too for your company. You can see the programme again anytime via the website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do check out our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also talk to us on Twitter @AJ Inside Story. From me, Peter Dobbie, and everyone on the Inside Story team here in Doha, thanks for watching. I will see you very soon. For the moment, bye-bye.